March 3, 1943. The sun rises over the Pacific, glinting off restless waves and the silver wings of American bombers slicing through the sky. Below them, an unsuspecting Japanese convoy, 8 transports, 8 destroyers, nearly 7,000 men. In 15 minutes, that convoy would cease to exist. The man leading the attack, Major Edward Lanah, wasn't supposed to be flying that low, just 200 feet above the sea. It was considered madness, suicide. Yet what he and his squadron were about to do would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. Their bombs wouldn't fall from the sky. They'd skip across the water like stones hurled by gods. And when they struck, entire ships would vanish in pillars of flame and spray. This is the story of how one pilot's forbidden idea turned desperation into domination and changed the course of the Pacific War forever. If you're fascinated by the hidden tactics, daring innovations, and human courage that shaped World War II, you're in the right place. Hit like to support in-depth history storytelling. Subscribe for more untold moments that changed warfare forever. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves stories where courage meets ingenuity. Now, let's dive into the skies over the Bismar Sea. In early 1943, the Pacific Ocean was a graveyard of ambitions. The Japanese Empire had reached the furthest edge of its expansion. Its supply lines stretched thin, its soldiers scattered across an empire that spanned thousands of miles. To the Allies, the situation looked dire. Every island fortress the Japanese held was another stepping stone toward Australia, and every convoy that slipped through Allied air patrols meant more men, more guns, more fuel, feeding the enemy's war machine. From New Guinea to the Solomon Islands, jungles burned, skies roared with dogfights, and the tide of war refused to turn. It was a conflict fought as much against nature as the enemy. Heat, disease, and isolation gnawed at both sides. Yet, beneath the chaos, one truth loomed. If Japan could keep its supply routes open, the Pacific might remain theirs. For the men stationed in New Guinea, the war was personal and punishing. American and Australian troops fought inch by inch through rain-soaked jungle trails where malaria and exhaustion claimed almost as many lives as bullets. In the skies above, Allied pilots faced another kind of torment: frustration. High-altitude bombers, designed for European-style warfare, had little success against Japanese ships darting between clouds and reefs. Bombs dropped from 5,000 or 10,000 feet missed more often than they hit, exploding harmlessly in towering plumes beside their targets. Convoys from Rabaul, Japan's stronghold in the southwest Pacific, slipped through again and again. Each one brought fresh troops and supplies to reinforce the Japanese beachheads along New Guinea's northern coast. And every successful delivery made the next Allied offensive that much bloodier. The math was grim. In one January 1943 operation, American bombers flew over 400 sorties and managed to sink only 2 ships. 2. At that rate, the Japanese could resupply faster than they were being stopped. The sea had become a cruel paradox, so vast, yet so narrow where it mattered most. The Allied command knew that without control of those waters, the island-hopping campaign could never begin. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, saw the problem with the clarity of a man who'd fought in the air himself. He understood that altitude was both a shield and a prison. Bombers flying high were safe from most anti-aircraft fire, but their bombs fell too slowly to hit a maneuvering ship. The solution, he realized, wasn't more bombs. It was better tactics. Something radical. Something dangerous. By the dawn of March 1943, the Pacific was holding its breath. Japanese convoys steamed confidently through the Bismar Sea, believing their destroyers and Zero fighters made them untouchable. In their wake, the jungles of New Guinea echoed with the cough of engines and the moans of wounded men, as Allied soldiers held the line with dwindling supplies. But far above those jungles, at the rough airstrips of Port Moresby, a quiet revolution was underway. Mechanics worked by lamplight, Pilots studied strange new bombing angles, and rumors spread of a technique so low and reckless that even seasoned aviators called it suicidal. It was here, amid mud, heat, and desperation, that the fate of the Pacific began to turn, not through superior numbers but through the courage to try something no one else dared. For much of 1942, Allied airmen had waged what felt like a losing battle against the sea itself. They had the courage, they had the planes, but they lacked results. When American B-17s or Australian Hudson bombers flew out to strike Japanese convoys, they often returned with empty bomb bays and heavy hearts. The footage from their gun cameras told the story. Bombs arcing gracefully down from the clouds, missing agile ships by hundreds of yards. From 10,000 feet, even a transport the size of a football field could weave, turn, or change speed in the time it took a bomb to fall. The result? A spectacular display of explosions and white plumes, but almost no ships sunk. Pilots risked their lives for outcomes that barely dented Japan's supply lines. Each failed raid reinforced a grim conclusion. Conventional tactics were useless in this theater. It wasn't just the pilots who felt the strain. The entire Fifth Air Force was trapped in a doctrine that no longer worked. In Europe, high-altitude bombing was gospel. Precision was a matter of formation, not instinct. But the Pacific was different. Here, nature played by no one's rules. Tropical weather shifted in minutes, concealing entire convoys under sheets of cloud. Strong winds blew bombs off target, and visibility often dropped to nothing. The enemy, meanwhile, was learning fast. Japanese convoys moved at night, hid in storms, and hugged coastlines where radar and reconnaissance couldn't easily track them. For every ship the Allies damaged, Japan seemed to send 2 more. To the men on the ground in New Guinea, it felt like trying to plug holes in a sinking ship with bare hands. Something drastic had to change, and soon. The numbers painted an even bleaker picture. In one early 1943 operation, over 400 bombing runs sank just 2 ships and damaged a few others. The effort consumed thousands of gallons of fuel, dozens of aircraft, and countless man-hours. The Japanese, by contrast, simply replaced their losses and kept moving supplies. It wasn't cowardice or incompetence that plagued the Allies. It was outdated thinking. Their machines were designed for the wide skies of Europe, not the twisting coastal routes of the Southwest Pacific. Each failed mission chipped away at morale. Crews joked grimly that they might as well be watering the ocean. Yet even in this frustration, a quiet defiance began to take root. Among the pilots, whispers spread of a new idea, a different kind of attack, closer, faster, lower. An idea so unorthodox it was officially forbidden. But in war, necessity has a way of making rebels out of soldiers. That rebel spirit found its champion in Lieutenant General George C. Kenney. A veteran of World War I, Kenney was as much an engineer as a commander, sharp, practical, and unafraid of breaking rules. When his staff told him that bombing ships at 200 feet was madness, he didn't dismiss it. He leaned forward and asked, "Has anyone actually tried?" To Kenney, the problem wasn't courage, it was imagination. If ships could dodge bombs falling from the sky, perhaps the answer was to strike from the horizon instead. His mind turned to reports of a daring pilot named William Benn, who had once made bombs skip across the surface of the sea like pebbles on a pond. Benn had died before perfecting the method, but the seed was there. Kenney realized that the future of air power might lie not in altitude, but in audacity. All he needed was the right man to bring that vision to life. When George Kenney looked at a problem, he didn't see limitations. He saw engineering challenges waiting to be solved. In late 1942, as reports of failed bombing raids crossed his desk, he realized that the problem wasn't his men. It was their machines. The B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc bombers were tough, reliable, and well-armed, but they were designed to fly high, drop bombs by the numbers, and get home safe. In the Pacific, that doctrine was killing efficiency. Kenney wanted an aircraft that could fly low and fight dirty, a plane that could duel with ships at point-blank range and survive the encounter. But the U.S. Army Air Forces had no blueprint for that. Headquarters wanted results, not experiments. So Kenney turned to someone who didn't follow blueprints to begin with: Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Paul Gunn was a legend long before he met Kenney. A former Navy pilot turned civilian mechanic, Gunn had been running air transport in the Philippines when war broke out. When the Japanese invaded, he refused to evacuate. Instead, he fought back with whatever aircraft he could find, patching up damaged planes with scrap metal, cannibalizing wrecks for parts, and flying missions most men would have called suicide. His family had been captured by the Japanese during the invasion, and that personal loss burned in him like fuel. By the time Kenney arrived in the Pacific, Gunn had already become known as the man who could turn any airplane into a weapon. To Kenney, that was exactly the kind of madness he needed. When the general asked him if he could modify the B-25 for low-altitude attacks, Gunn didn't hesitate. "General," he reportedly said, "give me a few days, and a few machine guns." The result was something no manual had ever described. In the rough workshops of Port Moresby, Gunn and his mechanics stripped out the glass bombardier nose of the B-25 and replaced it with solid metal plating. Into that steel snout, they mounted 4 forward-firing C-50 caliber machine guns, then added more along the fuselage until some aircraft carried as many as a dozen, all firing straight ahead. The transformation was astonishing. The once polite medium bomber had become a flying gunship, a blunt, furious instrument of destruction. Gunn's crews nicknamed it the Commerce Destroyer. These modified B-25s could sweep a ship's deck clean of gunners before dropping their bombs, suppressing anti-aircraft fire and ensuring survival during their deadly approach. Every plane that rolled out of Gunn's workshop looked a little different, hand-built by mechanics who worked barefoot in the tropical heat, welding, bolting, and praying that their improvised creation would hold together in combat. When Kenney watched the first test flights, he knew he was looking at the future. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Fly so low that the enemy couldn't dodge, fire enough guns to silence their defenses, and release the bombs close enough to skip them into the ship's hull. It was part aerial science, part suicide pact, but it worked. Gunn's modified B-25s roared across practice ranges at treetop height, their guns rattling like thunder as they perfected the timing. Still, raw machines weren't enough. Kenney needed a leader, someone with nerves of steel, the respect of his men, and the audacity to fly through a wall of gunfire without flinching. He found him in Major Edward "Eddie" Lanah, a man whose reputation for fearlessness bordered on myth. Under Kenney's orders and Gunn's machines, Lanah would take this dangerous experiment and turn it into a doctrine that changed the war. Major Edward Lanah didn't look like the kind of man who'd change the course of a war. Barrel-chested, perpetually sunburned, and with a grin that bordered on defiance, he had the relaxed confidence of someone who felt more at home in the cockpit than on the ground. His men loved him because he led from the front. Literally. If he ordered a mission, he flew it himself. In a world of command tents and clipped briefings, that made him different. When Kenney handed him command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron in late December 1942, Lanah saw more than a promotion. He saw a challenge. His new aircraft, the modified B-25s, were fast, loud, and mean, but also unpredictable. They shook under the recoil of their own guns, their noses heavy with steel and ammunition. Yet, to Lanah, they were perfect. He looked at those brutal machines and saw opportunity, an instrument for rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Training began almost immediately, and Lanah made it clear from day one that hesitation had no place in his squadron. He pushed his men hard, sometimes too hard, but always with purpose. To master skip bombing, the technique of bouncing a bomb off the water into a ship's hull, timing had to be perfect. A fraction of a second too soon, and the bomb would ricochet harmlessly over the target. Too late, and it would detonate beneath the plane itself. That kind of precision couldn't be taught in a classroom. It had to be earned through muscle memory, through repetition. Their proving ground was the wreck of the SS Pruth, a rusting British steamer stranded on a reef off Port Moresby since the 1920s. Day after day, Lanah led his crews over the wreck, diving to 200 feet, dropping practice bombs, pulling up just before impact. Each man learned the rhythm, the dance between altitude, speed, and instinct. The training was brutal, and it came with a cost. One B-25 misjudged its dive, clipped the mast of the wreck, and exploded into the sea. All aboard were killed. The next morning, after the funeral, Lanah assembled his men. He didn't give a speech about sacrifice or glory. He simply said, "We learn, and we keep flying." Then they went right back to the air. That moment defined him. To his men, it wasn't callousness, it was commitment. The stakes were too high for sentiment. New Guinea was on the brink. Japanese forces were building airfields within striking distance of Australia. Every convoy that reached their garrisons meant more Allied deaths on the ground. Lanah knew that the only way to stop those supplies was from the air, and that meant his squadron had to be perfect. So he trained them until their precision became instinct, until the line between courage and madness blurred. By late February 1943, the 90th Bombardment Squadron was ready, cocky, confident, and deadly accurate. When Lanah reported to General Kenney that his men would not miss, it wasn't arrogance, it was fact. They had turned an untested concept into a weapon. And just in time, intelligence reports from Allied codebreakers revealed a major Japanese convoy departing Rabaul, bound for New Guinea. 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by destroyers and 0 fighters. It was the lifeline Japan needed to hold its ground, and the perfect target for Lanah's experiment in low-altitude warfare. As dawn approached on the first days of March, Lanah's men prepared their aircraft, checking guns, calibrating fuses, and whispering small prayers over the engines that would carry them into history. They didn't yet know it, but in a matter of days, they would execute one of the most devastating air attacks of the entire Pacific War. For the men of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, training was no longer about learning. It was about survival. Every flight over the waters near Port Moresby tested the limits of nerve, precision, and instinct. The concept of skip bombing was simple in theory. Fly low, release the bomb at the right moment, and let it bounce into the enemy ship before detonating. But simplicity hides danger. At 200 feet above the water, the margin for error vanished. Even a gust of wind or a fraction of a second's hesitation could mean the difference between glory and death. Pilots trained until they could judge speed and altitude by feel alone. The hum of the engines, the vibration of the fuselage, the way the horizon blurred through the cockpit glass. To an outsider, it looked reckless. To Lanah's men, it was becoming art. Each day began before sunrise. Mechanics sweated over the modified B-25s, tuning their overloaded engines and cleaning machine guns until the metal gleamed. Lanah would brief his crews in short, clipped sentences. Never dramatic, just direct. You'll dive, level at 200, release at 300 yards, and pull up clean. Then, with the calm of a man who lived for danger, he would lead them out over the sea. They practiced bombing runs on the SS Pruth, flying so low that their propellers kicked up salt spray. The roar of engines echoed across the bay, followed by the splash and whistle of dummy bombs skipping across the water. From the ground, it looked like madness. A ballet of speed and destruction. Yet with every pass, they improved. Soon, their bombs struck within yards of the rusted hulk. The precision was uncanny, the coordination flawless. Lanah's promise to Kenney, that his men would not miss, was becoming a reality. But progress came with loss. The wreck of the Pruth claimed more than one life. When a crew crashed during a low pass, their B-25 disintegrated in a fireball that burned for hours on the reef. The squadron gathered for a funeral under the tropical sun, uniforms stained with oil, faces streaked with sweat and salt. No speeches, no music. Just silence and the distant rumble of waves. That night, some men drank quietly. Others sat by the runway, staring into the dark. Lanah joined them, not as their superior but as their equal. He didn't tell them it would get easier. He simply said they'd want us to fly tomorrow. And they did. That brutal honesty bound the squadron together. They weren't chasing medals. They were preparing to defy death itself, and they trusted Lanah to lead them through it. By late February, word began to spread through the Allied airfields. The low flyers were ready. Crews from other squadrons watched them with a mix of awe and disbelief. Rumors swirled that they could hit a target blindfolded, that their modified B-25s could cut through ships like blades. But beneath the swagger, the men of the 90th knew the truth. They were betting their lives on an unproven tactic, one mistake away from disaster. Still, there was something electric in the air, a sense that they were standing at the edge of a breakthrough. Every lesson, every death, every scar had led to this. Then, on a humid morning at the end of February 1943, orders came down from headquarters. A Japanese convoy had left Rabaul, bound for New Guinea. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, thousands of troops. Lanah looked at his men and said only 4 words: "Get your birds ready." History was calling. Far to the north, beyond the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the Japanese base at Rabaul pulsed with activity. To Allied pilots, Rabaul was a name spoken with a mix of fear and respect. It was the fortress of the Pacific, ringed with anti-aircraft guns and brimming with fighters. On the night of February 28, 1943, under the dim glow of signal lamps, a massive convoy began to move. 8 transport ships, their hulls heavy with 6,900 troops, ammunition, fuel, and supplies. 8 destroyers formed a protective ring around them, bristling with guns. These men were bound for Lae, New Guinea, Japan's attempt to reinforce their crumbling front. The operation had been planned with precision. Meteorologists predicted storms to conceal the voyage, and the Japanese Navy believed that Allied air power, still recovering from months of combat, couldn't possibly intercept them in time. It was, on paper, a perfect plan. But the Pacific was a place where luck turned fast. Allied codebreakers in Australia had already cracked Japanese signals, learning the convoy's destination before it even left port. Each radio message, each course correction, was quietly intercepted, decoded, and relayed to General Kenney's 5th Air Force. While the Japanese captains believed they were slipping through the night unseen, their every movement was being shadowed by invisible eyes. Reconnaissance planes, B-24 Liberators flying long patrols over the Bismar Sea, kept their distance but tracked the convoy's progress day after day. When clouds hid the ships, the crews waited. When the weather cleared, they called in the coordinates. The moment the reports reached Port Moresby, Kenney began assembling his strike force. Heavy bombers, light bombers, and fighters all were to converge in one coordinated blow. The trap was already set. Out at sea, however, the Japanese were confident. To them, the plan was flawless. Their destroyers carried seasoned crews. Their air escort would meet them near the northern coast of New Britain. The storm fronts above the Bismar Sea promised concealment, and the captains trusted in the discipline of the Imperial Navy. As the ships cut through the waves, sailors worked quietly on deck, their eyes adjusting to the dim light of dawn. Many believed they were sailing into another routine reinforcement mission. Some even wrote letters home, speaking of how the Americans lacked the courage to face them at sea. But beneath that surface calm, a sense of unease lingered. The Bismar Sea was narrow and treacherous. The clouds that promised protection could just as easily hide an ambush. And in the back of every captain's mind was a silent fear, the fear of Allied aircraft appearing suddenly, low over the horizon. On March 1, 1943, that fear began to take form. At 3 p.m., a B-24 Liberator flying high above the storm layer spotted the convoy through a fleeting break in the clouds. The message it sent back to Port Moresby was short, but it changed everything. Convoy sighted, course southeast, speed 8 knots. Within hours, Kenney's staff was plotting the attack. The plan was daring, almost reckless. The first wave would come from high altitude, B-17s meant to scatter the formation. Then, from below, Lanah's low-level B-25s would strike at 200 feet, skipping bombs directly into the ships. Australian Beaufighters would lead the assault, strafing the decks to silence anti-aircraft guns. Every element would hit within minutes of the others. It was a symphony of destruction, timed to the second. As night fell, the Japanese convoy sailed on through the darkness, unaware that the next dawn would bring not storm clouds, but fire. March 3, 1943. The dawn broke over the Bismar Sea like the opening of a curtain, soft pink light spilling across endless water. To the Japanese convoy below, it was a peaceful morning. To the men above, it was the beginning of chaos. At 8:55 a.m., Allied reconnaissance confirmed the convoy's exact position, just southeast of Finschhafen. Within minutes, the airfields at Port Moresby erupted with sound. Engines roared, propellers screamed, and the ground crews waved their final salutes as the modified B-25s of the 90th Bombardment Squadron thundered down the runways. Behind them, the A-20 Havocks, Australian Beaufighters, and long-range B-17s took to the air. The sky filled with the silver and olive drab of war machines bound for history. From his cockpit, Major Edward Lanah could already see the mountains fading behind him and the glimmering sea ahead. Somewhere out there, 8 transports and 8 destroyers awaited their reckoning. The battle began just after 10 a.m. The first wave, B-17 Flying Fortresses, arrived high above the clouds, releasing 1,000-pound bombs from 7,000 feet. The explosions were enormous, towering columns of water drenching the Japanese decks. But, as before, most of those bombs missed. The Japanese captains, trained to evade high-altitude attacks, swung their ships in tight turns, presenting narrow profiles to the falling ordnance. Their confidence returned. This, they thought, was the same old Allied tactic. They were wrong. Moments later, the sea-level horizon erupted. 13 Australian Beaufighters came in low, barely 50 feet above the waves, their engines screaming. They opened fire with cannons and machine guns, raking destroyers and transports alike. Japanese gunners, still focused upward, were caught off guard. Entire gun crews were shredded in seconds. Then, through the chaos and smoke, Lanah's formation appeared. Dozens of B-25s bearing straight down on the convoy at 200 feet, guns blazing. What followed was a display of coordination and courage unlike anything the Pacific had seen. Lanah's bomber led the first attack run. The modified B-25s fired continuously, their forward guns pounding Japanese decks with streams of tracer fire. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. At just 300 yards, Lanah released 2 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses. They skipped across the ocean like thrown stones, striking the side of a destroyer with devastating precision. One exploded at the waterline, the other beneath the keel, ripping the ship apart. Behind him, other crews repeated the maneuver, their timing flawless. One transport burst into flame, another capsized within minutes. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Destroyers swung wildly, colliding with each other as they tried to avoid the incoming aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns blazed, but the low-flying bombers were too fast, too close. For 15 minutes, the sea became a cauldron of fire, water, and steel. By 10:15 a.m., the battle was over. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. 8 transports and 3 destroyers were sinking or already gone. Survivors leapt into the burning sea, clinging to debris as Allied fighters circled overhead. Lanah's men had lost only a handful of planes. The technique they had drilled for weeks, the forbidden 200-foot bombing run, had worked beyond imagination. Pilots radioed back in disbelief. Direct hits, almost every one. Even General Kenney, hearing the first reports, could hardly believe it. The Japanese convoy, once the pride of Rabaul, was annihilated. Yet amid the triumph, a grim realization settled in. Thousands of Japanese soldiers now floated helplessly in the oil-slicked water. What came next would test not just courage but conscience, and the Pacific would never forget what happened after the smoke cleared. When the last explosions faded and the roar of engines dwindled, an eerie silence settled over the Bismar Sea. The water was black with oil and strewn with debris, broken planks, twisted metal, and the bodies of thousands of men. Smoke drifted across the surface, curling around lifeboats packed with Japanese survivors. For the Allies circling above, it was a shocking sight. In just 15 minutes, a convoy that had carried nearly 7,000 troops was gone. What had been a display of innovation and precision now looked like apocalypse. Some airmen radioed home with stunned voices. Others watched wordlessly as the sea turned into a floating graveyard. Major Lanah's men had achieved a victory that would echo through military history. But the war was not done with them yet. Orders were coming. Orders that would force them to make choices they would remember for the rest of their lives. The next day, March 4th, Allied aircraft and PT boats returned to the area. Their mission was not just reconnaissance, it was elimination. Command had decided that no survivors were to reach shore. The logic was brutal, but, to many officers, unassailable. Every Japanese soldier rescued would live to fight again on New Guinea, costing Allied lives in future battles. The orders were clear: strafe the lifeboats, machine gun the rafts, leave no enemy capable of returning to combat. To the airmen who had just witnessed the destruction of an entire fleet, it was a command that cut deep. They had seen their comrades shot down, heard stories of Japanese pilots attacking parachuting airmen, even tales of captured soldiers executed or tortured. The Pacific War had hardened hearts on both sides. Yet as Allied pilots lined up for their strafing runs, many hesitated. The men in the water were no longer combatants. They were helpless. The attacks went on through the day and into the night. Pilots reported seeing groups of survivors waving white cloths or clinging to wreckage, only to be engulfed in gunfire seconds later. PT boats combed the wreckage fields, firing on clusters of men illuminated by the flicker of burning oil. The official justification cited necessity, to prevent rearmament and re-engagement. But for many who carried out the order, the memory lingered like a scar. Years later, veterans would speak of the moment in hushed tones, some defending it as an act of war, others haunted by it as an act against their conscience. One pilot wrote in his diary, "We were told it had to be done, and we did it, but I still see their faces when I close my eyes." The Battle of the Bismar Sea had proven the power of air dominance, but it also exposed the darkest corners of that power, the point where victory blurred into vengeance. By the time the sun set on March 4th, the devastation was complete. 12 Japanese ships lay at the bottom of the Bismar Sea. Of the 1,600 troops who had departed Rabaul, fewer than 1,300 ever reached land. Thousands more were dead or lost at sea. Allied losses were astonishingly light, just a handful of planes and 13 airmen killed. General Douglas MacArthur would later call it the decisive aerial engagement of the Southwest Pacific. Strategically, he was right. The Japanese never again attempted a major reinforcement convoy to New Guinea. The sea routes were closed, their garrisons left to wither in isolation. But for the men who flew that mission, the victory was complicated. They had witnessed courage, precision, and innovation, but also horror. In their success lay a question that has haunted warfare ever since. When does necessity cross the line into cruelty? And can even the most righteous victory escape the shadow of what it costs? In the days following the Battle of the Bismar Sea, word spread like wildfire through the Allied ranks. What had once been dismissed as a reckless gamble was now the stuff of legend. The low flyers, as Lanah's men were called, had done the impossible, destroyed a convoy protected by destroyers and fighters without the support of a single Allied ship. To General Kenney, the implications were enormous. The battle had not only saved New Guinea but had proven a radical truth. that land-based aircraft, when properly trained and equipped, could dominate the sea. Skip bombing, once a fringe experiment, was now a proven tactic. Reports and diagrams flooded Allied command posts explaining the exact speed, altitude, and fuse timing that made the maneuver work. Across the Pacific, aircrews began modifying their own bombers, eager to replicate the success. A new era of air warfare had begun. Major Pappy Gunn's workshop became the heart of that transformation. His once improvised modifications were now officially sanctioned. Engineers from other units arrived at Port Moresby to study his gunship, B-25s. Soon, entire squadrons were being converted to the new configuration. Armored noses, heavy machine guns, low-altitude training. The results were immediate. Within months, Allied airmen across the Pacific were using skip bombing to devastate Japanese supply lines from the Solomons to the Philippines. The skies that had once been the Japanese Navy's safe haven had become hunting grounds. Convoy commanders who had once relied on destroyer screens now feared every approaching shadow on the horizon. The ocean, once a shield, had become a trap. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. For the first time, the Japanese Navy realized that the enemy could reach them anywhere, at any height, and at terrifying speed. The impact reached far beyond the Pacific. Allied strategists in Europe studied the reports with fascination. The idea of combining suppressive gunfire with precision bombing influenced everything from anti-submarine warfare to close air support. Aircraft designers took note. The concept of heavily armed attack planes, machines that could strafe, bomb, and survive heavy fire, became central to post-war design philosophy. The lessons of the Bismar Sea directly shaped aircraft like the Douglas A-26 Invader and, later, jet-powered attack craft of the Cold War. The principle was simple but enduring. Control the approach, overwhelm the target, and make every strike count. Even decades later, military instructors would point to the 90th Bombardment Squadron as a case study in tactical innovation born from desperation. It was proof that necessity doesn't just breed invention, it breeds transformation. For General Kenney, the victory confirmed what he had believed all along. Technology alone doesn't win wars. Imagination does. He had defied the manuals, trusted a maverick mechanic, and empowered a fearless pilot to test an unproven idea. Together, they had rewritten the rules of air combat. In the months that followed, the 5th Air Force became one of the most effective fighting forces in the Pacific. The Japanese convoys never recovered. Their garrisons in New Guinea withered, cut off from supply and reinforcement. And yet, even as reports of new victories reached headquarters, Kenney often paused when he read Lanah's name. The Major's triumph had already become legend, but his story wasn't finished. The man who had led his squadron through hell and turned the tide of a war would not live to see the peace that followed. Major Edward Lanah's triumph at the Battle of the Bismar Sea was the pinnacle of his career, and, tragically, its end was not far behind. Less than 2 months after that fateful attack on April 30, 1943, Lanah's life was cut short in a crash at Dobodura Airfield. It wasn't combat that claimed him, but the same boldness that had defined him. Attempting his signature maneuver, a low, diving approach followed by a sharp climb, his overloaded B-25 stalled and fell from the sky. The plane struck the ground and exploded, killing Lanah, his passengers, and crew instantly. For the men who served under him, the loss was devastating. The man who had taught them to trust their instincts, to defy fear, and to challenge the impossible was gone. His funeral at Port Moresby was simple but somber. No fanfare, just the distant hum of aircraft passing overhead, a reminder of the skies he had conquered. In the months that followed, the 90th Bombardment Squadron continued to fight with the same aggression and precision Lanah had instilled in them. His wingman, Captain John Henbury, took command, leading the unit through the remainder of the war. The skippers, as they called themselves, became legends across the Pacific, their kill tallies growing with every mission. They sank ships, destroyed convoys, and carried Lanah's tactics into every engagement. Each pilot who dove toward a target at 200 feet did so with the ghost of their commander in mind. In every successful strike, in every daring, low-level run, his influence lived on. Even as new aircraft and technologies emerged, the principles he'd forged, courage, precision, and adaptability, remained the core of effective air combat. His men didn't just survive the war, they carried his philosophy into the generations that followed. Lanah's legacy extended far beyond his squadron. The low-altitude attack doctrine he perfected became a cornerstone of Allied air strategy across the Pacific. It changed how commanders viewed air power, not as a blunt instrument of destruction, but as a precise tool capable of crippling an enemy's logistics and morale. The concept of forward-firing, heavily armed bombers inspired designs that would dominate warfare for decades. Yet perhaps his greatest contribution was not technological, but human. Lanah had proven that innovation in war does not come from committees or laboratories. It comes from individuals willing to risk everything for a better way. His approach embodied a truth that has echoed through every generation of aviators since. Sometimes, to survive, you must fly lower than fear itself. Today, few remember Edward Lanah's name outside of military circles, but his impact endures. The Battle of the Bismar Sea stands as one of the most decisive and daring engagements of the Pacific War. In just 15 minutes, Lanah and his men had changed the balance of power, closing Japan's supply routes and paving the way for Allied victories across the region. But beyond strategy and statistics lies a deeper legacy, that of courage, imagination, and the will to challenge convention. Every pilot who pushes the limits, every commander who dares to defy doctrine, follows in his wake. Lanah didn't live to see the end of the war he helped to turn, but his legend survived the wreckage. He proved that even in the darkest chapters of history, innovation and bravery can pierce the clouds, and that sometimes all it takes to change the course of a war is one pilot, flying 200 feet above the sea.